Hello and welcome to the debate between me and Paul Dohse. My name is Randy Seiver. The debate topic is justification based on the righteousness of Christ alone versus justification by new birth. I'll be defending the first part of that proposition, justification based on the righteousness of Christ alone, and Mr. Dohse will be defending justification by a new birth. Now, I'd like to begin by stating a few areas in which Mr. Dohse and I are in agreement, and that need no debate. First of all, salvation, and we agree that salvation involves more than the imputation of an alien righteousness. That is, the imputation of a righteousness that does not personally belong to us. In the work of sanctification, God, of course, works into his people a righteousness that does belong to us. But that's in a completely different category from justification altogether. Secondly, we agree that it is impossible for a true believer to sin in such a way as to bring himself or herself into condemnation. Paul said there is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. Number three, Jesus did not come into the world as a person who needed to keep the law in order to earn a righteousness that did not inherently belong to him. Instead, he came into the world under the law and was judged by that law, and according to that standard was declared to have the righteousness that he had inherently. And so we would agree that Jesus did not need to earn something that he did not have. Fourthly, we agree that the law of God ultimately requires love for God and love for neighbor and is not simply a matter of adhering to a list of rules. Now, here are the areas of disagreement. Listen to these carefully because this is what we're going to be debating. Mr. Dohse believes that Jesus did not come to fulfill the law, but simply to put an end to the law. The corollary to this belief, in his view, is that it is impossible for believers to sin because there is no law against which we can sin. Number two, he believes that justification can have nothing to do with law, since Paul states in Romans chapter 3 and verse 21 that justification is, quote, apart from law. According to him, if justification is apart from law, it cannot have anything to do with obedience to the law, no matter who keeps it. Even if Christ keeps it, it can't have anything to do with justification because justification is apart from law. Since there is no law that can give life, law must not be the standard of justification, according to him. According to him, the new birth is the standard of justification. Number three, he believes that the righteousness God requires for justification is an imperfect righteousness that apparently can stand apart from any external standard to determine its validity or authenticity. When a believer fails to love God and neighbor completely and perfectly, it is not sin, according to him, but is merely weakness. Number four, he believes that justification is not a legal standing before God, but a state of being. He ignores the entire judicial or legal motif that Paul employs to explicate the believer's perfect standing before God. He tries to explain the entire issue of the believer's state of righteousness according to the new birth. According to his view, the believer's hope of acceptance before God rests not in a perfect righteousness that God can approve, but in the absence of any law that can condemn our imperfect acts of love, or at times a complete lack of love. Number five, he denies that there is any continuing application of Christ's redemptive work by his work of intercession. There is no need for such intercession, since it's impossible for the believer to sin, and if the believer cannot sin, then he needs no intercessor. Now, it's my belief that his misunderstanding and misrepresentation of virtually everything I believe, and those who would confess to the same confessions that I would hold to would believe, is based on his misunderstanding of a statement that was made by Mr. Goldsworthy at Southern Seminary several years ago. This is what he said, Mr. Goldsworthy. when the ground of justification moves from Christ outside of us to the work of Christ inside of us, the gospel and the human soul is imperiled. It is an upside-down gospel. Now listen to that statement again, because it's extremely important. And I would completely agree with this statement. This is what he said. When the ground, and listen to that very carefully, when the ground of justification, that's all he's talking about. Not talking about sanctification, not talking about regeneration, he's not talking about glorification, he's talking about the ground of justification. When the ground of justification moves from Christ outside of us to the work of Christ inside of us, the gospel and the human soul is imperiled. It is an upside-down gospel. Now, from this one statement, Mr. Dohse has deduced that, number one, Calvinists believe that God does no salvific work whatsoever within the believer. Secondly, he has deduced that Calvinists deny that individual new birth exists. Thirdly, he has deduced that Calvinists believe that justification is progressive. That is, we become more and more and more justified as we continue. Number four, he has deduced that Calvinists conflate the works of justification and sanctification and believe that sanctification completes justification. Number five, he believes that Calvinists believe that Christ continues to obey for us so that we don't need to obey in sanctification. And the list of bizarre conclusions goes on and on. And the reality is that not one of these statements accurately represents what Calvinists believe. There are 6 issues I'd like to address regarding our disagreement. Number one, what is the function of law? This is exceedingly important, because if we're going to understand this issue, we need to understand the function of law. Secondly, what is the definition of justification as used in the Scriptures? Number 3, what does Paul mean by his use of the term without the law in Romans chapter 3 and verse 21? What is the issue he's talking about? What is without law? Number 4, what about the imputed righteousness of Christ? Mr. Dohse says there is no such thing as the imputed righteousness of Christ. He would argue that we have the righteousness of God by, and he uses the word literally, by literally being born again, and in being born again we receive the very righteousness of God himself, not perfectly, because we still have weakness, but that is the basis of our justification. And then finally, well, not finally, but do believers still sin? Is it possible for a believer to commit acts of sin? It's an important question. Number 6, what happens when we take this issue out of this motif, this judicial motif of justification, and put it into a different motif, as we find it in some of the books of the New Testament? What happens when we look at this whole question in terms of another motif? So we're going to look at that as we continue in this discussion. First of all, what is the function of law? The law, listen to this carefully, the law cannot give life judicially because it is not the function of law to do so. The law can neither make a person guilty nor make a person innocent or righteous. That is not the function of law. The law is the standard by which innocence or guilt can be measured. An example, if I weigh 300 pounds, stepping on the bathroom scale can't fix that. Why not? Because it is not the function of the bathroom scale to fix my overweight problem. I cannot be justified by the scale in terms of my overweight or not being overweight. The scale can't do that. That's not its function. It is not the function of law, whatever law, to remedy guilt. The law cannot make us better. The law can only declare its findings. The law is a standard. It is like the mark on the wall. I can back up to the mark on the wall, and I can judge my height by that mark on the wall, but that mark on the wall does not make me any better or any shorter or any taller than I actually am. It is simply the standard by which I am judged. In a courtroom, a judge and jury can find a defendant either guilty or not guilty based on the standard of law, but a judge or jury cannot make the person guilty or not guilty. That's not their function. That is not the function of the law by which they're being judged. They can declare them to be guilty or not guilty based on the law, but the law cannot justify or condemn. The law can simply declare what it finds. Okay? The reason Paul wrote just righteousness does not come by the law is simply because that is not the function of the law. Righteousness cannot be understood in any other way than legally, because righteousness is a legal term. Secondly, let's talk about justification and how that term is used in Scripture. Justification, as defined by its biblical usage. Just consider 3 verses. First of all, consider with me a verse in Proverbs 17:15, where the wise man said, "He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the just, both of them are alike an abomination to the Lord." Now, just for the sake of argument for a moment, let's assume that he's saying that justify there means to make inherently and internally righteous. And try to make sense out of that verse in those terms. You can't do it. Why not? Because he's not talking about making a person righteous. He's talking about an unjust judge that looks on a guilty person and declares that person to be righteous when he knows all along that the person is guilty. And he's talking about an unjust judge that looks on an innocent person and, knowing that he is innocent, declares him to be unrighteous. And he says that kind of judge is an abomination. Now, if that judge could actually make the person internally righteous, he would not be an abomination at all, but he would be worthy of the highest praise, would he not? And so the verse simply is talking about a declaration, whether right or wrong, a declaration of righteousness or guilt. Whatever it means, it is set over against condemnation, which again is a declaration, not a making of making a person guilty or not guilty. 2 more verses. In Luke chapter 7 and verse 29, we are told that even the tax collectors justified God. And then in Romans chapter 3, we read that you may be just when you speak. And of course, Paul is speaking about God, that God may be justified in his words. Now, does that mean we can make God just? We can make God righteous? Of course not. We can't make him what he is already. But what we can do, and what these tax collectors did, and what the people Paul is talking about are doing, is what? We are declaring him to be what he is. It is a declaration. And that's what justification is. Justification is not making a person righteous. Justification is a declaration about the person. It's important that we understand that. Even in modern usage, when we speak of justifying a person's actions, we are speaking about declaring those actions righteous or unrighteous, not about making them righteous. We'll continue in the next session. Hope this has been helpful.